in my opinion, subsidizing the general fund, because if that's the case, if the goal was to make that type of money, then why not sell the utility to a third party? And then truly get that revenue, or that, revenue basically.
Well, the revenue comes from the tax, I mean, it's a pass-through tax. So
Right, yeah, I
some
understand
cities,
that.
I'm sure, elect not to have any franchise fee, right? I mean, there's got to be a few out there that say, they all have.
I'm not aware of any municipality that doesn't have a franchise fee. I mean, anymore, utilities are in your right-of-way so much, and there's such an impact to it. I'm not aware of a single municipality that doesn't have a franchise.
Water, electric,
Because
telecommunications.
it's really a fee
Yeah.
on the impact of their use of your right-of-way is the real rationale for it.
But this is our
It's moving funds
using
from,
our right of way.
yeah, it's moving funds from one pocket to another, basically, is what it is.
Well, if I
And-
may, something else to consider, some cities also have not only a franchise fee, but also a pilot, but also, they have
Yes.
both, because you have opportunity cost lost, money that you can't invest somewhere else because they're benefiting from being a tax-exempt entity. They don't pay rent, they don't pay taxes on profits, they don't, and I'm not saying we're all the same city, we're trying to differentiate which one we're talking about, but you can't use that money, they're getting a break because they don't pay taxes on anything. So there's also some cities that do both.
Mhm.
So I'm just throwing that in there.
And I think that our current ordinance does provide for both. I mean, currently
We
we
do
have...
not have a pilot, but you don't.
You don't have a pilot?
We do not have a
No.
pilot agreement or a pilot transfer.
But the current ordinance for 2296 does provide for a pilot.
It mentions a pilot, we do not
Yes.
have one.
Okay.
So is the franchise fee 5%, or is it just a set number?
It's a set number that was already living in the budget.
So it may or may not be 5%?
It's very,
Correct.
if you calculate it, it's roughly
It is.
5%. It's 5.1, 5.3,
Okay.
5.6, it's around.
It's a formula, not so much a number.
Right.
Okay.
And it's a projected gross revenues, correct? That's where it comes off of. So,
That's what it used to come off of. Formula.
okay.
Well, I want to get back real quick to use of utility revenue. Obviously, in McPherson, it appears that they must have exempted themselves from state statute here specifically so they could spend utility surplus on economic development.
Mhm.
But when it comes to transferring and merging into the city or any other funds of the city, that's already provided for by state statute. So the transfers that we did make this summer
We didn't make
We're-
transfers. We didn't make transfers, other than the ones that were already budgeted. You're talking about the realignment of penalties?
Yeah, for
That was
2014.
Restructure. We didn't do transfers for that. I don't want to confuse things.
Okay.
Ryan, as we look at this section two, as you read it, the section B of that's almost redundant, because they could roll that extra revenue into a general fund and then apply that to economic development, through an economic development fund under the general funds, correct? Am I reading that wrong when I see it that way?
I think that's right. You know, the state, yeah, I think that's right.
Because once
I
you
mean,
put it into the
because
general
can
funds, you
expend-
can use it
That's
with
right.
any of your funds that you've part of the general fund budget,
That's
which will be economic development funds, that would be capital improvement funds, that would be all of those things.
Right, I agree with that.
Which I would like to kind of comment on, Ms. Mill. One thing to consider is the opportunities for economic development for the city and what we might be able to do if we start to look at providing funds for economic development to be able to help reduce some of the tax burden to the residents. Because the balance and the ability to reduce that is through providing additional land uses and additional economic development opportunities. That's what's going to really give some of that relief.
But we
Our
wouldn't have to have
residents.
any home rule charter ordinances to create that opportunity with the funds. The statute's written so we could do that right now.
Right, but if you go in and start to talk about not utilizing it for economic development, you're kind of limiting the options at a point before you really need to limit your options.
That's
So you might wanna keep them broad.
what B actually seems to do.
Right, you might want to
It
keep them
says,
broad at this point.
without B, you can use it for anything that's part of your general fund. With B, you're saying we're going to dedicate that towards economic development.
Right.
I suppose what you could do with B that you can't do with A is, you could make, well,
Mm-hmm.
never mind. I was gonna say you'd have to run the money through your general fund, but it says, or any other fund, so,
Right.
Right.
yeah.
So you could actually dedicate a fund
For economic development.
and pass it through.
Well, and I wonder if, and McPherson's done a very good job of attracting industrial development,
Yes, sir.
And that may be why they did theirs this way. The other thing is
so that
their
they can
mix.
say, we've even established by ordinance.
Right, plus their mix of their community mix and the diversity of their land uses is very, very different.
Sure.
So it's really important to look at kind of our mix of land uses, what we have, which is primarily residential. Their load's not like that.
So is that what you're proposing really, is to kind of flip things, make it 85, instead of 85% residential, make it 85% industrial, or?
No, not at all.
But that is what McPherson, I think, I've
That-
heard that number before,
Yeah,
right?
McPherson has a much different, they've got 4,000 manufacturing jobs.
So why
inside
are we using them as a model for what we want to become?
I believe that, the transmission and generation, transmission and billing for electric is not, they've got a much bigger industrial base that they can bill, but, and at the end of the day, you're still billing customers.
I don't think that we're going to be, I think from the standpoint of Gardner, I don't think it's going to make a lot of sense to be promoting industrial development. I think we've got an intermodal out west that's doing quite a bit of promotion for industrial development on its own. I think from a standpoint of commercial development or economic development, I think it makes a lot of sense to be able to utilize some utility funds for the purposes of procuring economic development.
I guess I don't understand why we're spending so much time on disbursements when we could do that. We could have done that. There's nothing in there to change any of these things. I don't know why this is a focus point so far.
What are we doing here anyway? I mean,
Yeah.
we have one line here that describes a meeting about a BPU, and we focus entirely on revenue. I guess I wish we could kind of go backwards in time and go and talk about your term paper on the BPU that you did, and, because I don't know, how many people were on this council when that was passed? You voted for it, I did not vote for it.
I think I may have been appointed right at the presentation time. I went back and looked, and I couldn't figure out.
So-
exactly.
You
let's
really
talk-
voted for it, it was March of 2012.
Yeah, let's talk about, I think that's a very valid point. As far as, I think two things. This BPU, which here's kind of the paper, as the result, the direction that we gave to council at that time was to go forth and figure out the best way, some options for organizing that BPU. It wasn't necessarily passing the BPU, per se, it was go and organize, because in the BPU committee, which Mark and Lee were both part of, we looked, at that time, we were very focused on water and wastewater and how we got the three utilities together. And there was a lot of work done and some various options that were explored, including McPherson, and basically the result was, the recommendation was, it makes sense to bring those three utilities together to manage as one. And so that was kind of the action. I think, Lee presented and said, here's the recommendation, and then the action was, we wanted staff to go forth and figure out what the options were, what that would look like. And then that part never happened.
Yeah.
So
But it did
that's
pass
where we are.
But don't-
4-1 vote.
Don't you think we ought to go back and revisit, now that we have two new council members, the pluses and minuses of those things? Maybe you could present your PowerPoint thing again, and we could look at that, just because, do you guys know much, have you seen that?
Yeah, I was in the meeting, I was in the audience, and I went to a couple of the meetings.
When did you review?
I reviewed the results of the BPU study committee, and I found that for the most part, to a great extent, they're spot on in their recommendations. I think that from the standpoint of organization, it would have been a little bit more difficult, at least initially. But I do believe that they had the recommendations correct.